A very good afternoon to our esteemed panelists for the day, Dr. Sanal Mohan. And before I get into introducing the panelists, I would just like to probably give a brief about Azaad Awaaz, our initiative from the Center for New Economic Studies, which aims to tackle an erosion of empathy in our society. And the monthly magazine, which comes out towards the end of the month, it focuses on the marginalized sections whose voices are often muted by the cacophony of flashy mainstream discourses in our media. Now, when I'm referring to marginalization, it's often crisscrossing across the different lenses of caste, gender, ethnicity, etc. And for this month's theme, we're focusing on religious minorities and their erasure. For the Samvad discussion of today, we're looking at the theme of caste in Christianity, conversions, and problems faced by the Dalit Christians, or rather the Pulayas. And with me, I have one of a highly celebrated scholar in the form of Dr. Sanal Mohan, who's joining us from Mahatma Gandhi University in Kottayam. And he joined as a lecturer in ethnography and has recently, I think, completed 27 years in service to the university as of 2020. Professor Dr. Sanal Mohan, in fact, has a highly exhaustive list of titles attached to his name, and I don't want to probably be getting into each one of that. Um, he was a Charles Wallace Visiting Fellow in History at the Center for South Asian Studies at Smuts back in 2003, and he was also part of the social anthropology program of Massey University in New Zealand in 2004. And I'm going to skip a few years and probably go into being a Smuts visiting fellow at the Center for South Asian Studies at Cambridge between 2017 and 2018. And in fact, added to this, he's published extremely in length in various research publications, and has in fact even authored a monograph titled "A Modernity of Slavery: Struggles Against Caste Inequality in Colonial Kerala." I welcome you, Dr. Sanal Mohan, for today's discussion. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this. Um,
Thank you, Sahil. Thank you.
yeah, Professor, probably I could
My
start off with,
pleasure to be.
yeah, thank you so much, Professor. I could probably start off with the discussion with the first question then.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, Professor, in your journal article, Creation of Social Space Through Prayers Amongst Dalits in Kerala, you had mentioned the role of the Christian missionaries in converting the lower caste Hindus dating back to the mid 19th century. Professor, so my question would be, to what extent did this facilitate their participation in the social spaces that historically they were denied access to?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. And it's a very important question since you are following some work which I did some time ago, which was part of one of the research grants I received from Social Science Research Council in New York. Uh, they had this fantastic project on new directions in the study of prayers. That was very much part of their larger project of religion in public sphere. So you still have these the report of the studies and the other kinds of blogs and all sorts of contributions that came out of that project. And my article actually draws from the kind of research which I did, the data that I have collected during that time. Now, this article in question was published in the journal Religion and Politics, which was edited by Peter van der Veer, well-known social anthropologist. He had extensively worked on Indian society, religion, etc. Now, when I look at this question, as I have listened to you, I wish to suggest that possibly it is known to specialists in the field, social anthropologists, and historians who have been writing on the histories and sociologies of or social anthropologies of caste and the people who were oppressed by the caste structure. They all would suggest that it would be problematic to refer to these segments of Indian society as Hindus, because the fact of the matter is that if we look at the historical source materials of that time, and both indigenous sources as well as the writings of colonial administrators or missionaries and all those people, we would soon realize that, particularly the indigenous sources. As for Kerala, whatever was written in Malayalam during that time or before that, hardly any of these players would be, referred to as Hindus, because they were not part of the Brahmanical religious order, institutions, and practices. And I think it was true not just for Pulayas and similar castes like Parayas, Kauravas, etc., but it was true for even for Iravas. Yeah, so until the temple entry movement, none of these groups that I have mentioned would be thought of as Hindus, and therefore I think that's very important for our discussion. So therefore, the missionaries who worked among these people, they were, I think, not converting so-called, quote unquote, converting the Hindus. They were working among communities which were part of this particular exploitative and extremely oppressive social order that existed here. And they were the ones who, especially when you want to talk about the Pulayas, Parayas, and similar castes, who were actually the people who produced, uh, you know, in the land. So they were involved in agricultural production, all sorts of agricultural production. And therefore, whether you want to talk about rice production or anything of that kind, then you find that the labor of these people were the single most decisive aspect of the Kerala's economy. And I'm sure that that must have been the case with many other parts of the country if you want to write a history of their labor. But additionally, in the 19th century, you find these people, uh, the Parayas, etc. of Kerala, as as enslaved social groups, the people who could be bought and sold, along with land as well as separated from land, and they could be sold to different landlords. If you have a family of slaves, if somebody is owning a family of slaves, that owner was actually free to sell them to whoever offers, whoever would offer them a good price. So the father could be sold to someone, mother could be sold to somebody else, and children could be separated to separately sold to separate landlords. And the other point is also important, which is all the slave transaction documents, which I have shown in my book, would have an epithet which would say that if you want to sell, you sell this guy. If you want to kill this man or this woman, you kill him or her. So you are given absolute right. So in Malayalam, the term could be janmam, which is the order of owning land, yeah, which is kind of immutable ownership, unchangeable ownership until and unless the owner wills to sell this land, nobody has the right to alienate. So this was the old idea of land ownership, but obviously these lands could be owned by the upper caste. And in the Travancore region, the southern part of Kerala, you have Syrian Christians also as landowners. So therefore, you have Hindu upper caste and traditional Christians as owners of the land. And also, in some other cases, uh, sorry, some other cases we also have uh, Muslims also as owning, Dalits. I mean, see, the question is, it's not just because of the religion they were owning. It is largely because of the fact that these were the people who would be involved in trade and commerce, and whoever was involved in trade and commerce would also be involved in these kinds of transaction. And additionally, people would also be involved in transacting land, and therefore, most dominant groups, irrespective of what religion they professed, they would own slaves. So, therefore, this is one point which I want to say to begin with. Quickly to other aspect of the question, you have asked me to what extent did this facilitate participation in the social spaces that historically they were denied access to, which is very important. So, uh, I have studied this question as my basic training was in history. So, I tried to follow the protocols of historical research, reading whatever archival written materials that are surviving till this day, to this day, and also using the kind of archives and archival materials available in, for example, in UK and various other parts of the world where these sort of materials are, collated and kept in archives. And that research had shown me that the problem of social space was absolutely central. So these people were not allowed to use market, were not allowed to use any public place and space at that time. So we read in even in English records, it would be said that they were denied access to kacheris, they were denied access to all sorts of government offices traditionally, and obviously because of caste, the dominant religious people would never allow them to come nearer to their place of worship until the people, because of the influence of European missionaries, when they began to accept Christianity, and that's when they were given access to churches. But then within the Christian community, the dominant sections opposed this. They were not ready to share the sacred spaces with them. Therefore, you have this conflict within many churches in southern part of Kerala, where these people had joined the missionary organizations. Even within the Church Missionary Society, which initiated this so-called conversion, which received thousands of pulayas and parayas into their fold for a very long time. Even today, you may have congregations which are exclusively Dalit Christian congregation. There are also mixed congregations and mixed churches, parishes, but you do have separate parishes, separate congregations, and so on. So now, quickly to the question of space, I should suggest that the space, as where you have your interaction taking place, where you have your imagination shared, where you have your ideas being circulated, articulated, exchanged, etc. Those were spaces which were absolutely controlled by the dominant caste, because these people, you don't see them outside. They come together only when they are there to work in the landlord's fields, and therefore going along with these missionary churches and joining the missions would mean that they could start, or they could be part of a new social space. And what was referred those days as slave churches and prayer hall, I mean slave prayer huts. These are not big halls or anything, these are small huts, the same as that of the huts in which Napoleons would live historically. So, in the same architecture, the missionaries put up slave schools and churches where they would come. They would learn the scriptures. They would come together for prayers, etc. In places where there was a lot of oppression, people would be coming in the middle of the night. Sometimes after darkness alone, they could come because they could be caught by the landlord's men. And this coming together to read, to discuss, to understand the scriptures, the word of God, ways ways for these people, in which prayers were very sessions were very central because they were and maybe for the first time in their history, not today, things which were when you are uh, reading, they were actually which were not really part of their everyday discourses, everyday practices, and so on. So, therefore, new words, new phrases, new metaphors, new similes. So, if you can actually proliferate this sort of things and say that each was giving them a new kind of imagination, a possible critical thinking about the society in which they were living, and the kind of power structure of society in which they were enveloped. They were really being, kept as captives. So therefore, this sort of coming together for prayers and for worship and for reading and for learning the secular stuff, the alphabets. And also basic arithmetics, which they used to be taught at that point of time. So these were quite central to their evolution as modern human beings. And therefore, you find social space as very, very central because remember, this was a time when they could be physically harmed if ever they happened to be accosted or if ever they happen to be, encountered by an upper caste person on the road. So it was not possible. So I mean, obviously they cannot walk in the road which was used by the public, and they had to go through the bylanes, etc. So, and I think this is a very, very central problem of not just social space, even the very physical space of the place where you live in. You cannot step out there. You cannot go to the market and buy things. So this particular change of coming together for learning in slave church becomes very, very important in that sense. Yeah.
In fact, Professor, you just mentioned about how prayer meetings were very important in the evolution of these human beings in the context of social spaces. So, can you just probably
Yeah.
give a small brief about how you're linking social spaces to the evolution of them in terms of their, species, in the sense that how they were degraded before, but now ever since the prayer meetings happened and they could congregate, how did it help them in their emancipation?
Well, I see the point is even as they were coming together for this sort of congregational activities, learning, reading, or learning scriptures and so on, or listening to the word of God or the services in the church, the slave church, they could still be looked down upon by the others. Even those Syrian Christians who were part of the CMS, some were positively disposed towards these people. They were supportive. Some people who were very close to the European missionaries probably were supportive, but the rank and file of the church, drawn from the Syrian Christian community. I'm referring to the CMS in Kottayam and broadly in the south. They were not really happy with welcoming these people, and therefore there was a lot of conflicts within the congregations. But in the previous kind of situation, so before their joining of these missionary churches, and they would be just thought of only as untouchables, and also because of slavery was in existence even after their joining, because the first baptism had taken place. What is being referred to as part of the mass movement missionary phenomenon in 1854, early September 8th, at a place called Malapalli, little towards the hills in the Tiruvalla area. That's a place where, which is today in Pathanamthitta district, where this movement took place. And this was actually, remember, 1 year before the abolition of slavery, which happens only in 1855. So technically, still one could think of all those who were baptized by the missionaries, Reverend George Martin and the British missionary Reverend John Hawkesworth. One could think of the people who were baptized as still technically slaves. So they were liberated only later. And therefore, if you look at the social conditions of that time, two things should weigh our consideration. One is the enslaved status, and the other one is the uh, problem of untouchability. But I used to think that having read some of these histories and worked in this particular on this questions or in this area, my feeling is that the primary problem was that of caste slavery. And because these people could be bought and sold, and there was absolutely no concern for the kinship, or absolutely no concern for the familial relationship, and so on. So this was a major problem that was still in existence. And in fact, remember, we find slave transactions even in the early 20th century. So there is a very long history of that. Actually, we need to do a lot of research to understand how these things were evolving. So therefore, even after their joining the missions, they could be thought of as untouchables, who could be carrying pollution and so on. So therefore, in fact, this is a contested thing actually. So some would say that once they were baptized, then they would cease to be untouchables. But I guess the most significant thing is to look at what has been happening in their everyday experiences. And in their everyday experiences, the ethnographic data that I have collected as late as 2015-16 among Dalit Christians would tell us that these generations of Dalit Christians will be thought of as untouchable. So, the question of untouchability still continued to be there, and there were a lot of restrictions about the use of white clothes, and people were never allowed to walk in the road in white clothes, so they cannot wear those things. And we have come across the narratives of people who were forced to carry their Sunday best, wrapped up in rags, and kept in their sort of baskets, or hiding it in the kind of rain guards which they would make with areca fronds. Yeah. And keeping this along with them, they're carrying this in their hands. They walk up to the church, and from the church compound, they change their dress into white. And then once the service is over, they would, they would have to shift back to the rags and then walk out. So we have a lot of such narratives. So therefore, my point is, still you find the long arms of the practices of the old structures of slavery, caste, and so on. Not just for the first generation of people who have joined the mission. So this continues even in the second half of the 20th century. We find similar kind of restrictions existing. At least I can tell you from the ethnographic data that I'm familiar with, 1940s, 50s, etc. This was very much rampant. People were not, supposed to use proper clothes and so on. But remember, there was resistance to this as well. Even as there were restrictions, in many places you find people resisting these and coming out in white clothes, etc. So it is not just the kind of that upper clothes agitation in the South Travancore which should be spoken about. People have been writing about. There are a lot of research works on that. There is also another side to this story of the kind of uh, practice the kind of politics to deny structural violence that denied proper dresses to people. So there is a long history of that, the sartorial culture. So we have historians talking about the very idea of the cloth and how, for example, during the days of nationalism, people were began to wear khadi and things of that kind. So we have writings of Professor Deepesh Chakrabarti or Emma Tarlow. There are scholars who have looked at this, the kind of new sartorial culture which was connected with nationalism, khadi, which everybody knows. But in fact, here is a long history of struggle. So therefore, a struggle to acquire and use and adorn themselves with proper clothes. So finally, if there is a finally, I mean, a final kind of situation. People won this with tremendous amount of their social mobilization. So therefore, even as they became Christians, you find that many of these practices continued. But then, how things began to change is across generations. And this oppositional idea of acquiring new sartorial culture, new bodily practices, and new food culture, etc., etc. I mean, these are controversial things when you want to talk about food culture. It also would imply what was their economic condition. So, if the history is that we don't find most Dalit people eating rice as much as by the other communities because the rice used to be very scarce and quite expensive. Even as these people were producing rice, uh, it may not be the case that they would have been using rice as a staple food item. So some studies that I'm familiar with, some of those economic reports of the 1930s that talk about, actually they refer to the fact that they are not able to use rice as a staple food item because that's the only thing they have. So and also they get rice as wages. So it is 2 measures of rice, and they have to use that for all other requirements, and therefore they cannot eat this all the time. And they may get a little extra during the harvest season, but then for the rest of the year, they have to be content with this. So therefore, yeah. So I'm quoting from some of these 1930 materials where they actually talk about the economic conditions of these people. This is a particular study, the economic and social environment of church in North Travancore and Cochin by Mr. P.C. Joseph M.A., CMS College, Kottayam, which is published in 1938. And towards the end of this research report, the author actually talks about the fact that uh, these men and women who work, they get 3 rungarees of paddy. This is rice with outer husk for a best male worker. So these 3 rungarees are for a best male worker. Yeah, so this they have to meet all the expenses from this, and the female worker receives much less. And in normal times, every expenses, food, clothing, etc., has to be met from this. So therefore, even as they are producers of rice, they don't become real users of that. And obviously, they will also have this. So it's a kind of situation of absolute, engaging with scarcities of various kinds. Sometimes absolute scarcity. So therefore, so things have not changed. This is what I wanted to say, even as they became Christians. But there is the fundamental change comes in their attitudes. If you look at the mentalities of the people of that time, so there you find substantial changes. People began to have these new ideas of salvation. Whatever they have acquired through the reading of the scriptures. But remember, we have references even in 1857 about the slave Christians who have acquired literacy. There are names like, one of those slave Christian who was interacting with the missionaries named Joshua, from a village not very far from Kottayam. So missionaries have written about how this gentleman Joshua could read scriptures and interpret. So this is 1857. So therefore late 50s, late 1850s, 60s. That time you have people who started reading scriptures and so on. So which would mean that at least for some of them there was a certain kind of change in their perceptions and the new mentality. So therefore these are the changes that we come across. Then if not changes in terms of their economic conditions, they are not becoming people who own land. They are not becoming, not even marginal farmers. I don't think even in the 1860s, 70s, you find any of them as marginal farmers. They all continue to be employed as daily wage earning slaves or semi slaves, even after the abolition of slavery in 1855 in southern part of Kerala, Travancore, Cochin, and 1843 in Malabar. So I hope I have answered this particular question that you have raised. So
Yeah.
conditions before and after, yeah.
So,
After
Professor,
the
in fact,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, you had actually mentioned about caste slavery, and I'd like to link it to the next question, which is talking about why do you think that caste, being a social structure, transgressed the boundaries of religion, and why did this particular Dalit stigma follow certain
Yeah.
individuals who converted to Christianity, and how did it follow these individuals into the Christian faith as well?
Okay, so I think there are a couple of things that we need to be concerned with. One of which is that yes, these boundaries, these were forest boundaries. You see, because the communities over here, the dominant caste, they did share the same kind of orthopraxy. You see, this is something which has been studied by a lot of social anthropologists. In fact, the writings of Susan Bailey, who did this research on Christians in Kerala, or name all these Western scholars who did commendable research on the history of Christianity, the caste, then the quote unquote conversion, and all this. They have spoken about the fact that until perhaps the late 19th century, there was a consensus between the dominant Christians and the dominant caste Hindus, the Nayars and other upper castes, that they shared almost the same kind of social space. But it doesn't mean that there weren't conflicts. There were conflicts as well, but that conflicts becomes more pronounced only towards the end of 19th century, then which happens in connection with a lot of political changes that were engulfing Travancore state, different social groups vying with each other to get the patronage of the state and so on. That's when the older consensus between Syrian Christian elites and the Hindu dominant caste began to be under strain. But remember, even as we talk about this today, I don't think that there is so much of a strain between these dominant caste Christians and Hindus in Travancore. So look at Kottayam now, as we discussed this. We don't see, unlike in many other parts of India, this violence against Christians. It's not so much here. So the point of is that here in Kerala, which I guess you will also have noted, the Christians, especially the dominant Christians and Hindus, share same kind of social ideas about human dignity, ideas about shame, ideas about human worth, the sharing of social spaces, and even notions of untouchability. Although Christians may not have been practicing this, but they would have been unhappy to go along with prayers and prayers. So you find in there existing a variety of caste sort of things even in the everyday practice of Syrian Christians. So they may not want their sons and daughters to marry Dalits, etc., or the low caste people. And therefore, what I want to say in a limited time that we have is that there was sharing of these social values, ideas, practices, etc., by upper caste Hindus and Christians. And therefore, in Christianity, scripturally, that's the only thing. You cannot bring in caste. So that's what the most, the people would say when the question of this reservation as you send me these questions. When it comes, people would say that Christianity doesn't have caste, which is untrue. The point is, no religion based other religion, actions are created, social spaces are created and shared. That is what religion is. It is not just scriptures there. You have this lived religion where social values and religious values mingle together, and they solidify to create what religion in actual practices, right? So, and therefore you have separations within churches, separation in the cemeteries. So you have long histories and narratives of that. So therefore, what I want to suggest is that living in a caste society or developing in a caste society, Christianity in Kerala, I have spoken about it and written about it elsewhere, was yet another caste of the dominant groups. And therefore, whatever social values those dominant caste Hindus share were also shared by the upper caste Christians. And the rupture comes only with the coming of the missionaries, the external force elements, and the missionaries thought that at first their idea was to get their following from the upper caste Hindus, which was unfortunately not happening the way they thought. That's why I'm using the word unfortunate. They thought there will be a huge amount of drawing uh, from this sort of social groups, but only a handful of people must have come from the upper caste. Maybe a few scores must have joined in the course of this missionary activities from the 19th century onwards. I'm especially talking about Anglican missionaries, even the Catholic mission, which was there since the days of Portuguese. I don't think people have not seen documents suggesting that large numbers of liars or middle caste or even the upper caste, the Brahminical caste joining or the Brahmins joining. You may have one or two, but it is with that. It stops there. But when it comes to the enslaved caste, you find thousands of them joining. And therefore, this is a contestable thing whether one would say that once they have crossed the religious boundaries, then they become touchable and then they are welcome in public roads and so on. But I think the lived religion, as researchers in social sciences, we look at the lived religion, and there we find that the situations were very, very different. So therefore, the caste problem was very much. It is not actually. If you remember, it's not a religious question. In fact. Subsequently, in the 19th and 20th centuries, it was interpreted as a religious problem. In fact, the researcher and scholar Ruba Vishwanath, when she wrote a quite influential book on the Parayas in Tamil Nadu, which is titled as The Paraya Problem. So she has shown how caste was being referred to as a religious problem, and which leads to which was one of those ideas which were overplayed to deny the sort of constitutional protection to the Christians in India. So Rupa Vishwanath has written about it. So therefore, my point is that we need to really look at the lived religion where it is difficult to separate religion from other value systems, from social practice, and so on. And then the next part of the question is why did the Dalit stigma follow these individuals into the Christian faith? Now, I have a suggestion over here, because if you look at the intellectual history of the usage of the term Dalit, So quickly we could say that this was an oppositional category which was really introduced, invented by the critical anti-caste intellectuals in Maharashtra. And you see this even in Ambedkar's time. He had used this in his own writing. So therefore, there is a different history. So what I want to suggest is that it is not a carrying stigma. But I know there are people, there are communities who are thought of as scheduled castes, who do not want to use the term like Dalits. And there was a lot of controversy about it. Some time back, I think there was a stricture from the Supreme Court, if I am not mistaken, uh, directing the government departments not to use the term like Dalit. And also they were asking newspapers and other media outlets, both electronic and print, asking them not to use or desisting from using a word like Dalit. Now, from critical social sciences perspective or from critical historians perspective, I think we need to look at that as an assertive identity. I mean, we have all these scholars writing about this, Professor Gopal Guru and many others who had discussed this threadbare for such a long time, including Professor Kanja Aile and others who have been writing from the perspective of Dalit Bahujans. Follow them in my own kind of understanding or my own kind of critical reflection to say that we may modify this to say that they do not carry stigma as Dalit, because Dalit is an oppositional critical category which actually liberates people from the sort of stigmas that the shaming which caste can impose on them. So this is an oppositional category by which people would say that we understand who we are and why we are there and how we are there and what are our problems. It is because of the structural violence and the real violence imposed by the caste society. So therefore, I guess it's a liberatory kind of category. And then once Pulayas or Parayas and similar castes, then they became Christians. Since the people knew their caste background, and therefore the same thing was reproduced within the caste religion, within Christianity. So therefore, what I would suggest is that even those who are within the churches, I mean, those who are really conscious of the histories of their communities, that is what, conscious of the histories, they would feel that it is an oppositional category. But if X or Y person is not that politically, what I can say, oriented or politically informed or critically informed, such a person can definitely think of it as something which is stigmatizing. But in fact, it's not a stigmatizing term. This term is a critical term, and something similar to what is being referred to in other contexts as black, or even because that is used, or the African American critical thinkers and writers use this particular kind of category to refer to them. So therefore, I guess if you compare this internationally, if you compare this in the context of India, then the category Dalit becomes, I guess, very liberatory. Now, yeah, so therefore, but the other side of the story, as you have put it, is that so the whole idea of people belonging to the oppressed caste as being not properly human, who are something kind some who live in a situation of subhuman conditions, that sort of situations. And this is not because of their own say choice. They have not they didn't choose it. It was imposed. That kind of situation was imposed on them, and therefore they were denied of dignity, as to the point which I mentioned when we began. So therefore they were denied of all this what in today's parlance we could refer to as human rights. So therefore you have this lib religion reproducing this sort of caste within Christianity and so on. So therefore you have this being there, even as it claims to be, even as it's a salvific religion, it has a very different idea of what salvation is all about. Yeah, so let's look at the next one.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have. Yeah,
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 you did
please
answer
go
the
ahead.
question, Professor. Yeah. I'll move on to the next question. You had once defined the social reformer Ayan Kali as the most
Yeah,
important, a quote unquote, the most important Dalit leader of modern Kerala. I would
yeah.
probably request you to please talk about the impact that Ayan Kali, along with other social reformers of the 20th century, had on the socioeconomic status of Dalit Christians in Kerala.
Now, see, that's a very interesting question. Some people today, because of various other sort of politics, their own choices, may want to, really create a certain kind of oppositional idea, uh, or they may want to juxtapose Ayangali with other leaders, or especially with the leadership that evolved from Dalit community. But I think. Uh, the situation was much more complex and different from what many people want to make it out. For instance, if you look at Pambadi John Joseph, he was one of those founders of Charamar Mahajan Sabha. This was the organization of Kolayas in the northern part of Travancore. And they had, the southern part of Travancore state also. So John Joseph was a very interesting personality who, in fact, wrote a memorandum addressed to the British Parliament, wherein he invited the intervention of the British Parliament in resolving the problems of those Christians. Now, I happen to, those things are available in various formats. I happen to read the memorandum which he wrote and which actually bore his signature, the document which he actually signed. And he wrote that in English. And I guess he was one of those very, very rare personalities who knew English. And because he worked along with missionaries, he was from before that he was a school teacher, etc. He was an educated person. Why I'm saying this is to show that if you look at the biographies of Pambadi John Joseph, written by the late historian T.H.P. Chandarasheri, and also the biography of Ayangali that he himself authored, you get a very interesting kind of narrative. And I guess in both these books, the author talks about a very warm relationship that existed between Ayangali and John Joseph. So, and the other point, which is also interesting, in Ayangali's movement, you do have a lot of Dalit Christians in the leadership. And Chandarasheri, in his writing on Ayangali, refers to Thomas Vadyar and Harris Vadyar. These were teachers belonging to LMS schools, but they were related to Ayangali. I think his maternal side, and they were also Christians. But within the Sadhu Jana Paripalana Sangam, they worked. And similarly, there are a lot of examples where you find Dalit Christians, the Pulaya Christians, being part of the Ayangali's movement. But at the same time, you also have people refer to some speeches of Ayangali in the Srimulam Praja Sabha, which was the native legislative assembly of Singapore, wherein he was representing the case of the Pulaya Hindus. And there were others who were representing the case of Pulaya Christians. And sometimes you find some opinions of Ayangali turning against Pulaya Christians. So these days, people show this sort of statements to blow up the kind of idea that, or to say articulate the kind of position that Ayangali was not very happy with these people, or there was a certain kind of conflict existing. Now, Ayangali's idea, because remember, the Travancore state was a self proclaimed Hindu state, and this representation was given to each of the communities, each of the different social groups, and the members of the members were supposed to speak only for the respective communities. They were not supposed to speak for others. So this sort of restrictions was there, but at the same time, Ayyankali was saying that okay, Korea Christians were being supported by the missionaries, and there are sentences of that kind. But then, therefore, he would say that these two groups should not be put together, etc. But these are not enough to say that there was a lot of I should say the animosity, opposition, or estrangement between the Korea Hindus and Korea Christians, or the movements or the movements represented by Ayyankali and others. Because in Ayyankali's movement, remember it is named as Sadhu Jana Paripalana Sangh. It was not Kolayar Mahasabha he was organizing, right? Which is very, very significant. So all these sadhu janam, which is a category that he was deploying, anybody could be part of that. But for a variety of reasons, you find predominance of players in it. But technically, this was open to all sorts of people, and actually, we had people from other social groups also being part of that. Now, but at the same time, this is a time when there were a lot of community organizations of Parayas, Kauravas, and so on. So, generally speaking, then obviously people will be, joining the movement of particular communities. So this problem was there. Now, the other thing is when Iyengali led movements against caste oppression in Trivandrum and in the nearby villages. This is 19, I think it should be 1913, 14 that time. And again, the very big mobilizations in Koilon, which is known as Perinadu Lehala and all that. I have come across writings of that period, both official and unofficial. The newspaper reporting, which would say that both Pulaya Hindus and the Pulayas who were part of LMS Church were attacked. Even Salvation Army, ICIS are pastors of Salvation Army, who are Pulayas were attacked by the Nayars. Yeah, so therefore this conflict actually involved all sorts of Pulayas without irrespective of their religious persuasions. So there are definite reports of that, and I have gone through, the Proquest historic newspapers archives. When you have in Times of India of that time, there the reporter based in actually Trivandrum, he writes about this sort of things and how the Salvation Army, LMS people were attacked and so on, churches burned down. And in Koilon, when this happened in 1916. Pulaya Christians were attacked, but the missionary over there. So he thought, he writes actually, he was one of those LMS missionary based in Koilam. I happened to read his report. He wrote to the London headquarters saying that he was under the impression that when these reformist Pulayas started their movement, mobilizing against caste oppression and so on, he wrote that I quote him, our people would not be part of this, unquote. But soon they also became part of this. The movement engulfed them. And in the violence that ensued, I think a couple of Nair houses were also set on fire. But scores of Pulaya huts were burned down. And the people had to flee from the place, and they were fleeing with whatever small things they had. All men, women, and children, they had to run away from there. And whatever small piece of, the kind of clothes they had were all burned. And this missionary reports that the people of his congregation would not attend church for the next 6 months. And they could come only after he mobilized resources, only after he could raise enough money to buy clothes for them. So you find this sort of shared life world of both Pulaya Christians and Hindus. I mean, at the same time, if you look at the things articulated in the Srimulam Prajasabha, etc., you may want to read it as, or X or Y may want to read it as a difference. But then remember the way in which representation was given. So the other point which is significant is that Iyengar actually wanted the players to remain as one social group. So he thought that if players were becoming Christians, that would undermine the bargaining power, the power to mobilize. The possibilities of a social movement of these people could be undermined if they one sizable section if it becomes Christian. He had these kinds of reasons. But this is very much different from the kind of idea today as opposed as Christianity and so on. I think his condition, I mean, if you read books like historian Charai Ramdas, where he actually talks about he's a fine historian who actually shows the historical documents, documentary proof for this sort of things, and he has written this in Malayalam, where you come across the reproduction of sort of information available in the archives as well as in other sources, and therefore, yes, absolutely, he was one of the greatest, Dalit leaders of 20th century. But at the same time, I think the larger society, possibly for a variety of other political reasons, or the dominant powers, always wanted to, appropriate him. And then now it is quite funny in Kerala. Everybody wants to appropriate him. And I'm not against people appropriating any leader. Let people do this. And most recently, the government had renamed this BJT Hall in the name of Iyengar, which I think was a wrong move because you cannot really, undo histories, isn't it? I don't think there is, as this I'm talking as a researcher in history or in social science. I think it is a meaningless act. It can actually appease some sections of society. This can really be, a shot in the arm for some. But if you really, with a balanced mind, you think about it, if somebody is so much concerned, there should be another monument for him. Why would this hall, which is already there, bearing someone else's name and so on, being touched upon Iyengar? It's a burden for him, I should say, as a student of history, a researcher in history. I would say that that was not the right move. But I'm bringing in this. People can disagree with me, and somebody can be very angry with me also. I'm saying this because of the fact that Iyengar remains as an iconic figure. That's why, So obviously they need. Oh yeah, so we don't have a memorial for him, and let there be a new one. Why? Why you go for an old? I mean, that's a good a piece of architecture. If you can renovate that, etc., etc., is fine. But I'm not very much happy with this sort of creation of history or denial of history. I don't know what it is all about. But anyway, that's a different story altogether. But the point of departure is to draw in the fact that he's an iconic figure. And that's why this sort of things happen. Yeah, so I guess I have
Yeah,
responded
definitely,
to.
Professor. In fact, I had come across an article written by you, I think around nearly a decade back, Professor, in the Hindu Business Line, and you were speaking about the Kerala model of development, which is considered as one of
Yeah.
the most socially developed states in the world in terms of its literacy rate, life expectancy, education, and land reforms. Yet, you had argued that there was existing a systematic unacknowledgement of the
Yeah.
deprivation of certain Dalit communities and, in fact, even Adivasi groups. in their socioeconomic standing. So,
Yeah.
Professor, I mean, you'd written it 10 years back. Do you think that still continues 10 years on, this systematic unacknowledgement of certain groups in Kerala
Well,
society?
yeah. Now what is happening is that because of all these critical studies, writings, etc., by many people, those who are part of the civil society organizations, social movements, those in academics, and so on, people have been writing about this. And now, in the last, no, it's not just in the last 10 years. If we want to look at that, maybe towards the end of 20th century, towards the last decade of the 20th century, we come across all this mobilization for land. And in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the land struggles have become very, very significant. So we have come across many sites of, many places, many sites where there is Adivasis and other marginalized groups coming together, fighting for land. For example, Chengara is very, I mean, this is something which has been noted by people not just in India, even outside, those who are concerned with, Indian politics or Dalit rights, human rights, and so on, or broadly, the oppressed social groups. People have noted the significance of that flashpoint which Chengara was, or else the land struggle at Aripa, or else the land struggles that have taken place at Aralam in Kannur district, or many places in Wayanad, including Mottanga, which was again another very significant place where all this mobilization have taken place. Now, if you look at the long series of mobilizations, so you find this happening in a very big way. Uh, Bringing up the land question as very, very decisive. That point is very much there, which is being articulated by social movements, and which is very quite politically sensitive kind of question. Now, in the academia, we do have a lot of scholarship on this question. In fact, we have this Western scholar, Luisa Stewart. So she has published a book on the Adivasi land struggle, and she had actually interviewed quite a number of people who were part of this mobilization. All, I mean, in various places in Kerala, sorry, where this land struggles have taken place, and therefore there is a heightened visibility of this. Now, but this particular book was Lisa Stewart's book was published, I think, sometime middle of 2010s. That's when this was published. So there is a lot of visibility of that. But then, do we find a substantial change in this condition? I think we are yet to see changes. Especially, we need to look at those who have been left out in the so-called Kerala model, especially Adivasis or parts of Dalits, and then I guess Dalit Christians are also part of that, because it doesn't come under the governmental category. So I don't think we have enough information on their land ownership and things of that kind. And in fact, I had occasion to talk to some of these functionaries of the local self-governing institutions, especially panchayats. After this, panchayat level planning and implementation of development activities, etc. So many elected members of the panchayats were of the opinion that although the Christians might be as marginalized as other Dalits, because there are no constitutional provisions, it becomes very difficult for them to intervene and effect positive changes in their social life, social and economic life. So there are no separate provisions for this, and many committed elected representatives. So they belong to different political parties. So I had occasion to listen to them when we at the Inter-University Center for Social Sciences of Mahatma Gandhi University, when we had been organizing a series of workshops for elected panchayat members. So that's when I got this opportunity to listen to them. And therefore, I think this remains as a big question. This the need for a critique of the Kerala model of development. And now, people have been talking about what happened to women. But then, of course, we may want to discuss women not as an amorphous group. The women belonging to different social segments. There are people belong to rich segments or so-called middle classes or various segments within the middle class and so on. And there are also working class women belong to other castes. There are Dalit women of different religions, or women who are from the fishing community who go and sell, fishes, and not just in the usual market, but you have a number of them walking. I mean, sometimes 20 kilometers a day up and down, selling fish. So we had done interviews of that kind with fishing communities in Puar, Alapi, and all that. So we know. I mean, it's not something new. Uh, Many people who have done that sort of researches would know this. So therefore, these are the three major groups left out: fishing community, then Dalits, and then Adivasis. And I think the situation continues in many ways, and now because of climate change induced the sort of floods and whatever, we do not know what is going to happen tomorrow, including this COVID-19 kind of situation. So we all know that it impacts the marginalized sections much. uh, but anyway, so these are unfolding scenarios. For what it is already there, this Kerala model question remains as, I think, very, very significant. So therefore, people have been left out. Yet you find, as I said, in the case of migrations of Dalits and Dalits Christians, etc., all of that happens outside the support of the government. It is not because of the government support. It's not because of other kinds of agencies stepping in. And at some point of time, certain missionary organizations you find helping out these people. But the migration from Travancore region of Kerala to Malabar, that actually happened without the help of any of this. That was one of those big initiatives of Dalit Christians and Dalits who learned about the availability of land from the dominant peasant groups of Syrian Christians in Travancore. So people were moving to Malabar in 1940s, 50s, and those who were working for them, these sort of middle peasants or whatever. So these Dalit Christians who were actually workers of and these peasants who were moving to the north of Kerala, they came to know about the possibilities of owning land if they could move out from Travancore. That's how we find families moving out. So if you go to such places today, you find hundreds of Dalit Christian families settled there, and they do have cultivable land, but they own this land not because of the state support. This was because of migration, and therefore I think migration was a major factor that possibly helped them. But if you look at the state's intervention in transforming the quality of life of people, in developing social groups, etc., that's where you get a share of the GDP that each segment of society is entitled to, and which is also important when you want to look at their citizenship. And therefore, who are being left out? Let us say they are being denied of social citizenship. That is a fundamental challenge here. But I don't know if this problem was really addressed in that way in Kerala. So I suggest that in order to look at this question that I wrote about, as you said 10 years ago, we need to bring in the questions of citizenship and see how people are denied of this. They need to fulfill their, this sort of what I can say, they fulfill their daily requirements, and helping them live as dignified human beings. So therefore, I think one central question here is our own lack of understanding of social citizenship when it comes to the extremely marginalized people in Kerala, who have been left out in Kerala model. Now, one can look at the intellectual histories of the social citizenship. It might go back to the days of the 19th century, when the missionaries were working among these people and raising them from their kind of social conditions. And then things have changed. It is how many years since? 1850s, I'm talking about. Yet we find, this huge lack of concern for these questions of social citizenship. This is what I said when we did that study of the 2018 floods. One of the questions that we actually tried to explore was that of the lack of an idea of social citizenship in the larger society. Yeah. So therefore, yes, many things continue even now. Yeah.
In fact, Professor, you had spoken a lot about the involvement of the state, and I'm going to ask you to shift your focus a bit towards the church, maybe. So I came
Yeah.
across a set of data published by the Catholic Directory of India, and this is based out of 2013 figures. And they're saying that despite
Yeah.
constituting roughly about 65% of the total Christian population, Dalit Christians do
Yeah.
not hold any or constitute very low representation within the system of the church. And when I'm saying the system of the church, it's of course the priests and the nuns. And I just want to know,
Yeah.
Professor, whether this would be a conscious effort as part of the church, and also how does this affect the participation of this marginalized group in terms of the social spaces in contemporary times?
And I think what you said is correct. There is a lack of representation. As you said, you have given the statistics. 65% of the total Christian population, right? Despite constituting roughly about 65% of the total population, Dalit Christians do not hold uh, official position, isn't it? That's what you said. Am I audible?
Yeah, Professor, yeah.
Yeah, so there is, I think, there are a lot of structural problems. Now, for example, see, for example, if you take Tamil Nadu, so in Tamil Nadu, interestingly enough, you have a very substantial kind of presence of Dalit Christians in the Catholic Church. And we have a lot of researchers. Now, for example, this professor at SOAS, the Department of Anthropology, David Moss. He has a very interesting book, Saint in the Banyan Tree. He talks about the Catholic Dalits of Tamil Nadu. And similarly, there are a lot of studies by many of our colleagues and friends based in India as well as abroad who have done very substantial research on various Dalit Christian groups. And so all of these studies really affirm the fact that the caste question remains as very, very central to the social conditions of these social groups. And now, if we bring in the Kerala situation, because even as you have a very substantial presence of Dalit Christians in Catholic Church, they remain as a non-entity. They remain as an oppressed social group within the Catholic Christian community of Kerala. And now, in addition to that, we also come across quite a number of other problems. I just want to signpost one problem which Dalit Christians who are part of the Latin diocese face now. Usually, the Latin Christians in Kerala, I know, as it is known to most people who know about the Christian communities, they are from the fishing communities. majority of them. But there are places where Latin Catholics are also from Dalit communities, like the Vijayapuram diocese in Kottayam, etc., or Kannur diocese in Kottayam. Sorry, the Kannur diocese in Kannur. Now, there is an interesting controversy that develops in Kannur, wherein the many within the church hierarchy would encourage Dalit Christians to enroll their children in schools as Latin Catholics. So, which would mean that these people eventually will lose whatever protection they are able to get from the government of Kerala now. Forget about this. The central question is the people are encouraged actually to deny their social origins, their identities. And I know very specifically that people have been told that, look, why you want to say that you are a Dalit, you are a Pulya Christian or a Dalit Christian, you are not that. You are only a Latin people who really hold very assertive category. Conflict takes place, but this the very same church leader happy to give representation for now within the say in the larger context of, because the force compete with within the community with the highly advanced, say for example, Syrian Catholic Christians in Kerala or other Catholics from the upper caste background in other parts of India. So they are always at a disadvantaged position. And I don't think the church cares for these people. So in places where, for example, in some of the tribal areas where you have substantial tribal Christians who are part of the Christian community, if it is an exclusive group, then things would be different. Even in Kerala, what I am saying is that in some of the places where you don't have dominant caste Christians in the Catholic Church, and I think the situation becomes very different. The people feel not being oppressed by others. They are able to, take decisions in relation to the church activities on their own. So those possibilities are there. But in mixed congregations and in other, I mean, the larger church, obviously, caste oppression has been normalized. Caste oppression has been normalized, and therefore people don't realize that what they are doing is actually perpetuation of caste within the church. And I remember reading somewhere one of the statements by one of the bishops in Tamil Nadu, I think in Chennai. He said that it is a sin to practice caste within church, and that Christians have to really confess this particular sin. But I mean, that's a good statement. Whether that has come, that has been, I mean, whether it has come out with any substantial result, we do not know. But the idea that the practice of caste, denial of equality, denial of fraternity, to which Ambedkar himself was referring to, is a major problem within the church, which the Catholic Church, I think, failed to address. They don't address this. In fact, I tell you one interesting example. Now, there was a controversy of land sale in which one of these cardinals were involved, and there was a lot of mobilization against him, and all sorts of things were happening. And in the controversy, as it was brewing up, one of those priests who were part of this mobilization against the cardinal, uh, this priest was actually humiliated by one of the lawmakers of Kerala. This gentleman, who is a quite well-known lawmaker in Kerala, he just said that look at this priest who has come out with accusation against this cardinal, who has given him authority to do so. And this lawmaker says that this gentleman This priest was actually son of a Pulaya woman. He was born to somebody from a so-called higher caste. This woman was working in this family, and that's how this guy, this priest, was born, and so on. This was actually circulated in all this media here. The lawmaker's name, I don't have any problem in mentioning. Is Mr. P.C. George. He continued to be an MLA even now. So this was reported in newspaper, and I read this in some online thing, or I was not in Kerala then, or somebody had sent me this particular thing. So i never uh, I never expected anybody from the official church to come out with any statement, criticizing this kinds of attitudes prevailing within the church. Nobody said anything against this man who made this absolutely sinful statement. And this man is there to support the priests who were accused of doing all this. But he brings in this idea of caste to humiliate the other person, because this man's mother happens to be a Pulaya woman. So now, see, look at this. So what I want to say is that this may be a small incident, but it shows it opens a window to a greater reality within the Catholic community in Kerala, which is why perhaps among the Catholics in India, this is the most powerful one, in terms of institutions, in terms of individuals who are powerful and so on. So therefore, we don't think that they are being driven by any sense of egalitarianism. It's because they have been shown that, as I know that they have been running all these institutions over here. I mean, I have no problem with that, because some of these institutions are so good. Absolutely, I appreciate that. But have they ever thought about, accommodating those Christians who, at least who are Catholics, in their institutions, etc.? They have not done it. And maybe there are some people who are at the lowest rung of the, jobs, like as sweepers or as peons. I don't know if such positions are there in institutions now. But when it comes to the larger question of appointing as assistant professors in a college, they hardly think of this kinds of things. So therefore, what is significant in the caste society was to deny any chance of intellectual creativity to the oppressed caste. This is what a Brahmanical social order have done. Remove them from any chance of intellectual activity. Knowledge production, that should be the right term. To keep them absolutely away from knowledge production. This is what once Professor Spivak herself has spoken about when she was talking about caste. That's what caste did, to keep people away from engaging in intellectual production, knowledge production. Now, if a Catholic institution accommodates people in positions where they can engage in knowledge production, that is when they actually move away from this sinful situation of caste. This realization is not there. And the other thing is completely normalized kind of existence of caste. They don't think of it as, not even as an aberration. It is so much normalized that they don't see that they are practicing it, because they are so much steeped in it that they cannot have an oppositional thinking. And therefore, unless and until there is a self-critical attitude, something that develops within the church, people want to talk about that and to bring in this critical consciousness. And I don't think they will be able to do this. And possibly in the days when we had liberation theology as a certain kind of alternative thinking, not as in terms of institution building, an alternative thinking within the church. There were possibilities then, but I'm not pretty much sure whether the practitioners of liberation theology actually talked about the conditions of Dalit Christians within the church. So I have had occasions to talk to people who were part of this movement or who had learned in the context of the liberation theology in the 1980s, late 80s, and so on. So I asked this question about. I haven't come across any substantial writing except perhaps Father Fernandez, the late Father Fernandez from Alapi, who has this interesting book in Malayalam, Aloysius Fernandez, Karuta Kurban, that's the book, where he actually talks about all these sort of things. So, therefore, the central question is whether the Catholic Church in India will come out of this, highly naturalized, normalized kind of understanding of what their role is. But in fact, that's not the way, in fact, even Pope Francis would think about it. So I know a Latin American professor, he's a quite well known sociologist, Professor Calderon, Fernando Calderon Gutierrez. So he, he works across Latin American countries, and some of his social science friends are friends with Pope Francis. So once I asked him, how uh, the Catholic Church under Pope Francis, especially as a person himself, thinking about the questions of social hierarchy. As a person who grew up in Argentina, he has got a very different kind of ideas about it. Now that's a point of that's a debatable point. What I'm saying now, but I see he's obviously an Italian origin person, but I don't think at no stretch of imagination you can have a socially committed kind of a priest coming up from the Catholic community in Kerala, who would follow these kinds of ideas. But if we don't have a continuation, an intellectual continuity to, for example, Father Tappan, who was one of those great figures of liberation theology, we don't have many such people, from here. And in my last point in here is this is largely about other Christian churches also. I happened to read a book which is a collection of essays in response to the theological writings of the late James Cone, the black theologian. And one priest from Kerala is a theologian. Unfortunately, I forgot his name. I might recollect that later. So this man with this Kerala experience was saying that, well, James Cone's theology of black liberation and other kinds of things may be good for the US. And this man says, we don't have similar problems in India. What sort of theologian he is? Probably this guy is from Kottayam, the person who wrote this. He's in response to Professor James Cone, could have been from Kottayam, and I guess he is from Kottayam. Then he says, look, this question of race, this question of color, this kinds of oppression is something which is there in the US. This is not something can have any kind of, what I can say, uh, conviviality to the social situations that prevail among Christians in Kerala. This is a good example of denial of what it is there. Now, see, you remember the point is, you don't think, or we don't think that a Dalit theologian would be invited to write as a response. Maybe at that point of time you don't have many, but today we have like Reverend Vinay who has been writing about Dalit theology from Kerala, who has published his extremely good books with Macmillan Palgrave. So there are such people from the Dalit community now. But he's from the Martha Maid Church, Syrian Martha Maid Church. He's not from the Catholic Church, but I do not know. At least I haven't come across. But I know there are people in Tamil Nadu from among the Catholic community, very committed. They are Dalits, critically oriented theologians and people of that kind. So such leadership can when they reach the terrain of actual knowledge production, they will be able to undermine these structures of domination. But otherwise, until and unless there is a realization within the Catholic Church that what they are practicing, what they had been practicing was a great sin, this is not going to change. My last point, I know it's a long time. There was a time when, I think in the 90s, I don't know if it is still there. Every Sunday every Sunday immediately after August 15th, used to be observed as Justice Sunday. This is demanding Dalit reservation for Dalit Christians. So I still remember reading some small pamphlet which was published by the Archdiocese of Changanassery. So there is a particular liturgy for that time. And the liturgical service will have symbolic representation of objects, right? So you know what they bring in? They bring in empty vessels. Empty vessels. I would say that look, we have been treating our Dalit brethren with these empty vessels. We never bothered to fill up their empty vessels with anything. And then they would have, I think, kind of sticks and things of that kind, symbolizing the fact that historically they used to oppress these people with this, which was a real history as well. These people used to be killed by both the Hindu landlords as well as Christian landlords. So therefore, without saying more about this, and I think there should be a total introspection by the Catholic Church. And I'm not saying that they will resolve all this, but obviously, the question of citizenship that I have spoken about, the state has to do its due. That's what is questioned with reservation and things of that kind. And I think it is much more connected with the social citizenship of those Christians, and they are entitled to have a share of the GDP or whatever is being given to other social groups. And in fact, scholars like Satish Deshpande, who is one of those very recognized sociologists of India, they have spoken about it. Likewise, the writings of sociologist Rovina Robinson, they have shown the kind of sociological and ideological dimensions of this. And similarly, the kind of works which I have said in the case of Ruba Vishwanath. And therefore, these reservation rights are to be talked about from a very different perspective. It is not just something there which is used to punish people, but to understand the historical situations in which communities have evolved. I think there should be a democratic realization and also the acceptance of the need for the dignified existence of human beings, respecting their freedoms, religious freedoms, etc. This is quite fundamental for democracy to flourish. Yeah.
In fact,
Yes.
Professor,
Yeah.
you had spoken about violence, and I do not have any data on me which particularly talks about the violence against Dalit Christians in Kerala's context. But on a much more macro level, like pan India, you see how there's been a certain sense of rise in the violence against
Yeah.
particularly Dalit Christians. And this was, of course, marked by the famous Kandhamal incident that took place in Orissa, like around in
Yeah.
2008. Yeah. So I just want to know, Professor, like when you see all these, when you approach this violence, do you think this is an attack against particularly the religion, that is Christianity, or is this a way of targeting one's caste group? Because majorly a large population of the converts are coming from a lower caste. So which form of attack, which form of structural violence is this attached to, Professor?
And I think you are right. I also tried to follow this. In fact, recent some of the NGOs like Dalit Rights Network and so on were actually really uh, documenting these kinds of things, and they have argued that in the context of the COVID pandemic, there was a rise in attack on Dalit Christians, Christians in North India, and I think most of them are from the Dalit communities. or maybe in certain places exclusively. Now, this has happened in some of the towns and cities in Uttar Pradesh and many other places. So therefore, and also in Madhya Pradesh, mostly I think these are not possibly mainline churches. Some of these are small Protestant churches or Pentecostal churches and so on. So where these are very ordinary people. They are not, I mean, influential people. They are not very rich and so on, isn't it? So therefore, we come across a whole lot of violence against these kinds of people, and which I think is quite a worrying thing. And because India being a country where religious freedom is guaranteed in the constitution, naturally the kind of vigilantism that have been taking place is a very big problem. And now, digressing a bit to the Kantamal, obviously that was one of those flashpoints. And I followed the news of that, and obviously a lot of things have been written about it and so on. And even before that, in Gujarat, the Danks area, also there was a lot of violence against Adivasi Christians. On politics in India. Churches are involved in conversions and things of that kind. But obviously, we should remember the fact that large numbers of so-called quote-unquote conversions or people joining the churches had been happening in the colonial period, and for a variety of historical reasons. And today, we do have a lot of anthropological and other kind of writings on this question. Now, how to resolve this? The resolution would come only when there is an idea by which the dominant caste in India or the dominant classes in India recognize the humanity of the oppressed caste, which is I don't think they are ready to do that. And that is why I repeatedly say the question of dignity comes in. So dignity and recognition, these are the two major things that people really want to have. And that's why people leave this, what is being referred to as the older forms of associations, older forms of allegiances, and so on. So they just want to move out of that. And then forms of Christianity offers them, some ways of transcending, or not just transcending, leaving out of all this and starting afresh. Now, this is often thought of as a transgression by the dominant castes and classes. And therefore, one could say that, and I still remember reading about small groups of people who were celebrating Christmas being attacked and so on. So those things have happened last year, I think. Or quite a number of them go unreported, but because of these human rights networks which are very active today, so the people have this idea of this kinds of things happening. And yes, I think this particular problem, as you have referred to, is on the rise, and both religious and caste dimensions are there. The people, when they want to move out of the traditional judgmani kind of system, the patron client caste oriented or caste induced, this dependency sort of thing, which has been existence in villages and small towns in India. And that's when actually they want to really restrict these people and unleash violence upon them. We have seen this on many occasions happening in India in the last maybe 25 to 30 years. This was, and there were certain flashpoints like Reverend Graham Staines killing and things of, instances of that kind. We have seen that. This was, I think, in the late 1990s, perhaps, this sort of things was happening. So since then, we have a rise in this sort of thing. and which has been actually supported by the silence of those in political power. So therefore, I think the culpability of Indian state and the political class, the dominant political class, is a big problem. So we need to really think about the kind of attitudes that the courts have taken. If you want to look at the legal institutions, the police, the state, and the kind of nation state that India is. What's the kind of attitude of this state to that? Yeah, all these are real problems, and therefore, I think when it comes to the targeting of these social groups, obviously, both religion and caste becomes very very central, and we need to look at particular instances, and I'm sure that caste is very much central to this. So therefore, let's say the dyad of religion and caste they come together. So the other people might think of it as kind of symbolic violence by these people, the violation of the existing caste order. They are symbolically they're violating the the so-called symbolic order existing in the communities for such a long time, and such transgressions would never be allowed. And so they are many of them are attacked. Some got killed. So this will remain as long as the state is in support of this, and that is the unfortunate part of that. So when this sort of things happened, you still remember the then prime minister said, "Let's have a what was it like?" He said, "National debate on this." Come on, what are you saying? Your people being killed, and then you're saying that there should be a national debate on. So he said, I still remember reading in newspapers a national debate on conversion. So that's what the then prime minister said. I mean, these are ploys of the political class, and I think we should look at it like that.
Professor, in fact, now I think we've come to the last question, and this goes
Yeah.
back to the question of reservation that you had mentioned before. And the official narrative from the state's end is, since 1950s, in fact, that the religion of Dalit Christians, it's egalitarian in its roots, and that is why their social and economic standing is much better off as compared to the other lower castes. And I mean, this was said back in 1950s and still holds regard in today's time. So at least from the state's end. And you, as a social scientist, probably could tell us how relevant do these arguments hold in contemporary times. And in fact, there's been a lot of call from Dalit Christians to fight for their affirmative action. And do you think that would be a right move going forward?
I think, yeah, so this is a real question that they are facing. But actually, if you look at the history of the mobilization, which is not a recent one, actually,
Yeah.
it has been there for a very long time. Maybe it goes back to the pre-independence times when people were actually demanding, protective discrimination, various forms of reservations, and so on. In the case of Kerala, this I just mentioned the memorandum that Mr. Ambadi John Joseph wrote. This is 1920s, mid 20s. So therefore, it has a very long history, right? It's not a new one; it's a very old one. And all the time, actually, the state took a very different kind of attitude. Now, in the Travancore state, because it was a self-proclaimed Hindu state, possibly it did not want to do much. Yeah, so yet these oppositional practices, opposition to caste hierarchy, domination, etc., continued. It was not something which was stopped. So it continued. Now, in the post-independence times, after this 1950 presidential proclamation, by which the reservation benefits was denied, benefits were denied to those Christians. So there were a lot of mobilization subsequently also. Now, if you bring in this whole idea of egalitarianism and so on, so people who have actually studied this have already shown how erroneous, how flawed these arguments have been. Remember, no religion can say that we are inegalitarian, not even Hinduism. So nobody will proclaim that they are inegalitarian, right? So, do you think that someone would come tomorrow and say that, look, we are an inegalitarian religion? So, they are doing a lot of research to show that this is an egalitarian religion and why people move away. So, therefore, this is a matter of convenience as far as the state is concerned. And as I said, scholars such as Sadish Deshpande and others have shown this. And they have also shown with the statistical data that the conditions of those Christians are not better off. Maybe in some urban centers, you have a small percentage of people who are okay. But the same thing could be said about many other countries. No, if I'm trying to catch a hot call in my hands, it's almost like that. They are very rich people, right? And I guess some of those in politics for such a long time, possibly they have amassed so much riches. And I don't think you have any other Christian politician of that kind. So therefore, what I'm saying is simply this: those who say this, they don't have any credible statistics with them to prove this. And therefore, what the government has been doing so far, there is, I think, a court case. There's a case in the Supreme Court which is being postponed and postponed endlessly. The court is asking for the state to file affidavits, and the state finds some alibi for not doing that. So this gets, postponed all the time. So that's how it is going on now. Now, the other thing is to see that I don't know. The point is, I think the single, probably the most important challenge to the caste hierarchy in terms of practice, perhaps, in the modern times, I'm saying, in the colonial period came from the Christian missionaries, and they were showing the so-called inegalitarian nature of Indian society. They were offering a lot of critiques and so on. And when I say modern times, I know that caste was critiqued for millennia together by various other oppositional systems of thought, Buddhism and other kinds of things. So therefore, in the modern times when we come, this is the biggest critique. And then most of the reform practices within caste happens because of this. All the Gandhian stuff, if you want to look at the sort of Harijan uplift activities of Gandhi and so on, they all feared that these untouchables might move away, right? And therefore, the protective discrimination, therefore the anti-caste activism of Congress and Gandhian politics. Now, so therefore, what will happen is that the the Christianity that was part of colonial missions could be the immediate other as far as the nation state was concerned, against which everything would be defined. And then the Dalit Christians would become part of the other. So that's how these things have happened. And from an academic point of view, critical social science, this is one way of looking at. Now, it is also interesting to note that Christianity is not something alien to India. If you look at the history of indigenous churches before the Europeans, Kerala has had a long history, which church historians trace back to the coming of Saint Thomas and so on. So, which has been contested by others within Kerala. So therefore, this Christianity was very much, and perhaps if you take Kerala, This Christianity is older than Brahmanical Hinduism in Kerala. So Brahmanical Hinduism comes only after Brahmins come in here, right? That's maybe from 7th century AD. But then before that, you have all varieties of Dravidian sort of practices. But then, if you look at it from this perspective, then you will see that Christianity is much more indigenous to Kerala than what Brahmanical Hinduism is. You got my point. Yeah, this is actually true. If you look at the chronological sequencing of events, practices, histories, and so on, it becomes very clear. And therefore, this Christianity is not the other. You know what I mean? The traditional Christianity is not the other.
Hello, Professor. Hello. Professor, can you hear me?
It's just this. So there is this whole question of othering, which has created this conundrum. It's a
Yeah.
kind of unresolvable situation. So what is required is there should be uh, you know uh, a democratic understanding of the citizenship rights of Dalit Christians. That is the whole point. It cannot be juxtaposed to any what do you call this the basis kinds of arguments which uh, the Indian elites have been raising. And the other point is that the dominant sections within Christianity were never supporting this
Yeah.
in India. They had abandoned the Christians, and the state also had abandoned. So therefore, you have this particular program. But if you look from the perspective of the social citizenship and also political citizenship, then this is a legitimate right which people
Yeah.
have been demanding.
Yeah, I think that would be it, Professor. Thank you so much for that fantastic insight into the point of Dalit Christians in Kerala. I think we've covered a lot of
Yeah,
topics within this one particular discussion itself. So, yeah, thank you so much again, Professor, for participating. This has been a really, really great experience. I'm going to stop the recording right